Hey, everybody, we'll get started here in just a minute. I'm watching the attendee list climb. So once that levels off, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, it looks like we're leveling off a little bit, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time to join us tonight here at the first of 3 town hall meetings where we're going to be engaging with you all, getting your feedback with respect to the upcoming coastal steelhead seasons. I know it's a big time commitment for you all to be here, and on behalf of the department, we greatly appreciate you again taking the time. This is a really important issue to all of you, obviously, and it's an important issue to the department. For those of you who have been tracking coastal steelhead for the last 3 seasons and have participated in these town hall meetings, you understand the issues that these fish are facing and how we're trying to thread the needle with respect to providing protection for wild populations or natural origin populations and trying to carve out opportunity where we can. And that's what we intend to do this year as well. So your participation, your ideas, your proposals are greatly needed and much appreciated. We had a lot of excellent input last year. We're hoping to see more of that this year. So I encourage you to use the time that we've carved out in these meetings to raise your hand and speak your mind. And also, we'll talk about this a little later, but we've got an amazing website with a portal where you can place your comments and your ideas. Those are reviewed extensively by Region 6 staff. I get to take a peek at them as well. So again, when we get going in the body of the presentation here, you'll see some links, and I encourage you to write those down because they've been effective for members of the public as well as the staff here at the department. We're scheduled to be here till 8 o'clock. We're going to be respectful of people's times and again appreciative of you carving out the time, but we will be ending right at 8 or shortly thereafter, again, out of respect for you all. We've got about a 45-minute PowerPoint presentation, and then we're going to dive into answering your questions and hearing what's on your mind. And maybe with that, I'll stop talking. I'll turn it over to James, who's going to introduce his team, and then we'll dive into the info we have for you. Go ahead, James.
Hey, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, thanks, everybody. I'm looking at the attendee list and see a lot of good friends in the audience and some names I haven't seen before, so that's exciting. So for efficiency, I'm going to just go through the folks that are on this call and introduce everybody. My name is James Losey. I'm the Regional Program Manager for Region 6. I've met many of you folks. The rest of the team is really important here, just so folks can recognize there's a lot of us working on this. We're not all here, but most of the coastal lead biologists and research scientists are. So that's really cool. I'm going to just go in order on my list. Erin Couch is in the communications department. She's going to be helping us with comments and chat and things like that. Joe Kudu is the Regional Hatchery Operations Manager for Hood Canal, Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then Grays Harbor Hatcheries. Amy Edwards is a region-wide stock assessment biologist. Jenny Whitney is the lead biologist on the Olympic Peninsula and in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And feel free to wave or, give a high five when we call your name there. Jody Pope is the lead biologist in Willapa Bay. You guys know Kelly Cunningham well. Rob Allen is the hatchery operations lead in the coastal region. and Toby Harbison is a regional research scientist. So that's our team. I also, I want to recognize the folks that are on the front line of communications in the regional office. It's been a pretty challenging summer for managing fisheries in Region 6. I think everybody can agree to that. And we've got a bunch of folks in Montesano that answer calls and field questions, and they do an awesome job. So I just want to give a shout out to those folks with all the help making this work. And then the last one is our enforcement officers are just doing a fantastic job helping support, really challenging fishery management topics. So all that said, and then I see I got one more person here that we had some Zoom issues. Mike Scharf is our lead biologist in Grays Harbor. Great, so I'm going to share my screen now and jump right into this presentation. Kelly mentioned this, but we're focused around coastal steelhead. There's been a lot of other topics moving with the short time period. We're going to focus on this one. But I want to make sure folks know, anybody on this team that you see, reach out after this if it's a non-coastal steelhead related topic, specifically a topic that's not focused on the preseason planning process. That's what we're here for. So I'm going to jump in. This is about 45 minutes of information. Some of it folks have heard, but there's some really important components that I think if you're new to these town halls or this preseason planning process that we share again to make sure we have a solid foundation here. First, I'm going to pass it off to Erin. Can you help us with this slide, Erin?
Yeah, thanks, James. Hi, everyone. I'll just go over a few Zoom housekeeping items with you all. Following the presentation this evening, we'll have some time for question and answers. And at that time, we invite folks to raise their hand. You'll find the raise hand feature down in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Or if you're calling in by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. Just to share any questions or comments with us. If you're having technical issues with Zoom this evening, you can use the Q&A feature and we'll be standing by to help you out. And if you prefer to share written comments, we also have a public comment form available online, and I'll put the link to that in the chat. So with that, I'll throw it back to you, James.
Thanks, Erin. So I just want to highlight the preseason schedule here and where we're at if folks are trying to figure out the best way to get engaged in this process. I'm going to jump right to this text in blue. That's where we're at today. This is the first in a series of town halls to talk about preseason planning. Today, we're going to share final escapement numbers and preliminary forecasts for the future fishery to come. But we've also got a November town hall and a late November town hall number 3. The work we've done previously, this text in gray above the blue, is describing this work with our tribal co-managers in the national park to put all of the information in one place in time for this meeting. It's also worth mentioning that we've got 6 or more touch points with Fish and Wildlife Commission or the Fish Committee. Those are open to the public too, if folks want to tune into those. They're not on here, but in the link below, you can see on this slide, we've got all the materials from this meeting, as well as the full calendar that has every opportunity you could want to jump in. The last note is we've also got a portal where folks can enter feedback there. It's an efficient way to just tell us what you're thinking, or if you've got specific proposals for this season. So we've already seen about a dozen of these comments come in the portal, and we encourage folks, if you don't have time to come to a Zoom meeting, jump on that portal, and that's at the link below as well. So I've got a lot of material to cover here. I'm going to go pretty fast, but some of it I think folks have seen, and then at the end we can revisit any slides. So on the right, I've got a map of Region 6. We're going to focus on the coastal rivers tonight, but a couple times I'm going to reference these Puyallup and Nisqually systems as kind of reference points. The first item on this agenda is the steelhead biology and stock assessment. I want to make sure we understand this fish and some of the constraints we're under managing it. We have a management framework as the second bullet that I want to talk about, and then review how we applied that management framework last year and places where we think we succeeded, or maybe places where we fell short of our management objectives. The third bullet is diving into the forecasts. We have preliminary forecasts. They're really like hot off the press. The team here has been working around the clock, and we want to share those with you now. And then we're going to share some of the regulation proposals we've heard and some of the ideas we've heard from folks. And then the last bullet, I think, is really kind of the important one here for us, is trying to hear what you think. And maybe there's proposals we haven't thought of, and this is our first chance to really get those in the room with all of us listening. So this first one here, I'm going to talk about steelhead biology and stock assessment. So just like any salmon life cycle, we've got freshwater and marine water as important components. Steelhead are no different, except for the fact that they can spawn more than once. So you'll see these circles don't end, right? They're iteroparous fish. They can spawn more than once. And that has important implications for the life cycle. I'm going to highlight a couple places we're doing specific work in this life cycle. So early on, we're releasing hatchery fish as juveniles. We're trapping both hatchery and wild fish in the river to enumerate abundance and ask other specific questions about juvenile productivity. There's a picture of a scale here. We can understand the age of those fish going out to sea. When we look at this kind of intersection between the fresh and the marine water circled in red, this is a period of time that's just critical for all juvenile salmon, especially steelhead. We know the majority of the mortality that occurs for steelhead occurs during this phase. So you're going to hear us talk about this early marine survival period. I have a map down here that shows the distribution of this fish in the ocean. This is different than salmon. They're offshore oriented. Gulf of Alaska, all the way to Japan is where these fish are operating. They're also surface oriented. So that's important, and we'll talk about why. So this is a big question mark also, I should say. There's a lot of data gaps about exactly what these fish do in the ocean, but I'm excited to report that over the last 3 or 4 years, our team and also other teams outside of the agency have been really picking at some of these data gaps and starting to fill them. So we'll talk a bit about that. When these fish head back to freshwater, this is most of the work we talk about today is this monitoring period when adults return. On the coast, we're really limited in terms of the number of tools we have to monitor them because, we have an absence of traps or dams in most cases. We have a solid catch record card system that provides a lot of information for hatchery origin fish that are harvested. Creole is really important in some places, but again, in the coast, it's limited. So we rely in large part on gillnet fisheries that provide information on timing of these fish. And like I said, catch record cards. And then from these various tools, we can sample scales and age and use this information to forecast future runs. And then the last piece of this life cycle I want to highlight is this. Well, I guess maybe a couple quick pieces here this is a picture of someone's knee hanging out of a helicopter counting reds. These are salmon or steelhead nests. So that's an important tool that we use to estimate how many of these fish made it through the fisheries and onto the spawning grounds. And then, of course, we trap and spawn fish in our hatchery facilities. Another really important place to sample and try to understand what's going on. So that was a lot of information. I have little links around sort of this life cycle. There's words there. These are all papers and science that you can go and dig into and learn more about this life cycle. And at that link below, we've posted those and all of the literature I kind of talk about today. We won't have time to dig into it. So feel free to study up and then come back and ask questions if you've got them. So I showed this slide last year, and it's, I think, a really important one to highlight what steelhead are dealing with in the ocean. So this graph here is showing estimates of ocean temperature, or specifically this global heat exchange in the surface of the ocean. And this is the part of the ocean that steelhead are operating in. And this paper here, Chang below, showed in 2020 that they recorded the highest heat content in the surface of the ocean ever recorded. And this was a big deal. It was described with this graph and showing this straight line going up. So these are increasing temperatures in the surface. The following year, they saw even warmer temperatures and documented that they beat their old record with even higher temperatures in the ocean. So this is a concern for steelhead because we know this is like the major part of the ocean that they're operating in. But we can take this information and try to understand specifically for coastal steelhead what it means. So this is a map here showing where tagged steelhead have been recovered in the ocean. So the majority of these are adults as bycatch and commercial fisheries over multiple decades of sampling. Kate Myers is the author of this work. She's done a lot of great work in the ocean, and it's been a foundation for us to try to understand if steelhead are operating in the ocean in these locations, we can study, the ocean here and try to understand what are limitations. And what we know from this work is the temperature 6 to 12 degrees is really the optimal temperature preferred. And sometimes the full migration is constrained to these temperatures. So that work's been used to model how these temperatures are changing and our expectation for how this will affect steelhead. So again, these papers are all online at our link, and feel free to download them there. So that work showing the distribution of steelhead in the ocean has allowed folks like in this paper to predict how that distribution of steelhead will change, and specifically describe this contraction of the available habitat in the ocean. Long story short, in the next 60 years, there's a expectation that this area of the ocean that steelhead prefer will shrink by 24 to 43%. And so the expectation is the ocean period is going to become more challenging for steelhead in the future. When we move to freshwater and we start thinking about issues steelhead may be dealing with there, this is, again, a slide I showed last year. And all of us, I think, on these calls, we're talking about this warm temperature in freshwater and in the terrestrial environment. And it was affecting, across the entire US. This was kind of what we were all talking about. This year, it's a little bit different in that we're not so much talking about temperature, but now we're talking about flow. So this was a recent article by Isabella in the Seattle Times, but it was followed by or preceded by numerous articles in the news, all the way from Southern California, even into the Midwest. This bottom left one talks about sort of across the country, these low flow issues. The reason I'm highlighting both the low flow and the high temperature issues for steelhead is we can understand that all of these salmon and steelhead use fresh water, but we know steelhead have an extended period in freshwater, typically 2 years, but sometimes up to 5. So we know when we have decreased flow and increased temperature, the expectation is, this is going to be an extra layer of stress for steelhead. So this is, a lot of sort of hand waving around what we're reading in the news, but I'm just highlighting these 3 papers, but there's a lot of them. These 3 you can go download on our website, but they're specifically talking about coastal steelhead and how the interplay between the marine and freshwater is expected to affect steelhead. So that's sort of, all of the literature and the research that's been done. If we focus specifically on our populations and the tools we can use to predict future runs in the rivers we care about, this indice here that I'm showing is one I've shown now for multiple years. And I think it does a really good job of describing this large scale change in the ocean, but also in cases the freshwater climate. So this graph here is showing changes or variability in the North Pacific gyre oscillation. So this is a basin scale ocean indicator that tracks really well with cold sea surface temperatures versus warm sea surface temperatures. So that when the NPGO is in these positive blue phases, we see a productive ocean, strong upwelling, cold water copepod communities, and a general favorable ocean for steelhead. In recent years, we've seen the NPGO in these warm phases. I've added the pink bar. That's the most recent value we've received from the author of this work who calculates the NPGO. And so you can see the most recent value is again in the red. And that's really signaling these warm sea surface temperatures in the area of the ocean that steelhead are operating in. And if we take our local data that we calculate here in our team and compare it to changes in the NPGO, that's what we're looking at in this bottom tile. So these are shifts in coastal steelhead survival from these coastal populations. And folks that fish coastal steelhead know that there's these periods where they've been doing really well and surviving well, and then these more recent periods we've been talking about where they haven't. And that tracks really well with the NPGO. The important thing for folks to note here is that these recent years of NPGO that have been warm, we haven't seen all of the steelhead show up from these years, right? They're still out in the ocean because they return as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. So we expect that steelhead that we're managing here in the coastal region will be dealing with these ocean conditions and freshwater conditions for the next at least 3 years. I have a little bubble here kind of summarizing what I've talked about, but I think we're understanding. So again, we're moving fast. If folks have questions, we can come back to any of these slides. So that was a lot. I kind of talked about, sort of the last 3 years of information from steelhead biology and stock assessment that we share at each town hall and packed it into that first bullet. So now we're going to jump into the management framework that we use and specifically how we used it last year and our performance of these populations. So there's some pretty basic considerations we need to know about steelhead, not just, in the coastal region, but also statewide. But some of these are really specific to the populations we're talking about today. So we have limited in-season tools. And what that means is, like I mentioned, we don't have dam counts in most places. And our precision around what is happening in season is really low. Effort shift uncertainty is a challenge. When we close one river, it's hard to know how that's going to affect a group of anglers in another river or fishing pressure. We have a recent history of over forecasting. As we've seen the steep decline of steelhead across the coast, our forecast models have been catching up to that decline. We have tribal co-managers in almost every system on the coast. We work closely with the National Park, who manages a large proportion of the Olympic Peninsula. We have escapement goals, so specific benchmarks for the number of fish that we need on the spawning grounds. And then, of course, steelhead have a really protracted run timing. Almost every month of the year in coastal populations, we have steelhead entering them. And so in order to protect this sort of large spatial and temporal distribution of steelhead, it's challenging to design fisheries so that we're not pulling, large proportions of one part of the run out while protecting other parts of the run. I'm not going to go through this slide. These are key terms, and I just wanted folks to have it in their packet so they could refer back if they heard something that, they hadn't heard before and didn't want to ask. There's these, so feel free to, print these off or do what you need to get these handy. So here, this slide just talks about kind of a basic, review of what we moved forward with the season last year, what we had in terms of tools. So last year for Creole, we prioritized some funding in 21-22 to support an increase in monitoring. And most of this work, we did a bit of a couch cushion exercise to try to craft fisheries in places that hadn't been monitored to the level we wanted or needed. And so we had a little bit of increased monitoring in the Hoe and the Quillute, but we had a really first time ever pilot monitoring program in Willapa Bay to kind of build the foundation for what an expanded monitoring program would look like there. And by monitoring, I mean Creole. We had our traditional spawning ground surveys that folks, I think, have heard a lot about. And most of this work's been going on since the 70s. We have hatchery rack returns that provided information last year. And then, of course, tribal fisheries data. So we met almost weekly with tribal co-managers during fisheries. So a recap of how that fishery went. So pre-season, we had low forecasts in all rivers and conservative season regulations with bank fishing opportunity in the Willapa, Quillute, and Hoe watersheds, and boat fishing opportunity in parts of the Quillute watershed. Doesn't say it here, but we had a number of rivers that were completely closed to fishing starting December 1. And then in-season sport and tribal catch suggested lower than expected run size, and that led to early closures for state and tribal fisheries in season. Specifically for sport fisheries, it was closures of those rivers that we mentioned in this first bullet on February 28th. And then post-season, I'm going to go over this, but preliminary estimates of escapement and run size are consistent with what we've seen in recent years and our forecasts. So here's a quick recap, and there's a lot on this slide, and we kind of went back and forth on how to present this, but we just wanted to show quickly what we saw in our Creole work So in Willapa Bay, on the Willapa River and Nacelle, we had interviewers out there talking to anglers, asking them what they caught. We had 404 interviews in Willapa River. Those anglers reported 38 wild and 21 hatchery steelhead caught. In the Nacelle, we had 282 interviews with 51 wild and 9 hatchery fish reported caught. In the Quillute, we had 546 interviews, 254 wild and 22 hatchery fish reported to be caught. And the Hoe is where the bulk of our Creole estimate takes place. There we had 1,135 interviews with 252 wild steelhead caught, reported to be caught. I know there's a strong interest in folks understanding how our tribal co-managers did last season. We got permission this year to share tribal co-management fishery data. And so that's what we're showing in this slide. In the first column, you can go river by river and look at what our projections preseason, and I say the state and the tribe agree on these preseason plans and expectations around catch. And that's what's in that first column. The second column is what we could call the realized catch. So these are the actual fish harvested. And these are preliminary estimates, but they're extremely close to what these final numbers will be, if not the final number. And what you can see in all cases, the tribe caught fewer fish than were expected. And specifically, the catch was less than 50% of what was projected preseason. And this was largely a result of management actions, these early closures that we talked about. So when we talk about management considerations in the coastal region, we can't avoid talking about the statewide steelhead management plan. So you might hear me refer to this as the SSMP. This is our guiding document to manage coastal steelhead and steelhead across the state. For me, when I'm reviewing how we did last year and the team, we're looking at 4 major parameters that are described in the SSMP. And these we call these VSP parameters, or viable salmonid population. So a lot of acronyms there, but the main point is we're tracking abundance, productivity, distribution, and diversity. And the one of these that folks are most familiar with in this room, I think, is abundance. We're often talking about the number of adult steelhead that showed up, and that's our major benchmark. So there's a good reason to be talking about them. But we're trying to improve our understanding of productivity, distribution, and diversity, and how to manage to protect that. So I'm going to use these 4 parameters as a way to review how we did last season tracking adult steelhead. So if we look first at abundance, the statewide steelhead management plan has pretty specific guidelines here. When we forecast a run that's expected to come in above the escapement goal, our management objective is the escapement goal, to assure that we put at least as many fish on the spawning grounds as our escapement goal. The second set of bold text here says it describes a scenario when we have a forecast that's expected to come in below the run size, or below the escapement goal, excuse me. And so in that case, our objective is to minimize mortality to wild stocks and in no case exceed 10% impact from all fisheries. So the best way to describe that is if we have predicted 1,000 fish to come back to the Chehalis River, that's below our escapement goal. That's a small number of fish for the Chehalis. But if we can design a fishery that impacts less than 10% of those 1,000 fish, and perhaps targeting hatchery fish or salmon or catch and release opportunity, then we're willing to move forward with that. And the statewide steelhead management plan supports it. But it's worth keeping in mind that those 1,000 steelhead returning to the Chehalis, 10% of those is 100 fish, if we do the math. Based on tribal allocation agreements, we can assume that half of those fish, 50% of those 100, will be utilized for tribal fisheries. So now we're down to 50 fish, and then we recognize that there's broodstock needs in the basin in some of these integrated populations. So these are the kind of considerations we're thinking of when we have forecasted run size coming in below the escapement goal. I've put this graph here. I'm going to zoom in on it. This is the Chehalis River, and we've gotten to the place where this is kind of the go-to graph to show people all of the pieces of steelhead trends in each watershed. So I'm going to walk slowly through this first one with the Chehalis, and then we'll move more rapidly through the rest of the systems. So this is the same graph that I just showed you, but missing some of those lines. So what we're looking at here is the run size or trends in run size for the Chehalis River steelhead population. So we can see that it's been declining over time, the total number of fish returning to this river, and then the red dot shows us the most recent estimate of run size. So this is new information, and I'm going to use this kind of red dot to describe information you hadn't seen in the past. So this is our estimate of run size from last season, and you can see it's slightly below the run size in the prior year. We can also add in other lines here. This is the escapement, the bold line. So these are the number of fish that spawned in the Chehalis watershed. It's worth noting that the red dot has another red dot under it. So we have two, the escapement and the run size are updated from last year, but we had no harvest from tribal or state fisheries in the Chehalis River. So those dots are right on top of each other. The number of fish that return to the river is the same number that returned to the spawning grounds. So the last piece of this is a trend line that's describing the trend in the run size over time. So now I'm going to move down to the Willapa and then move north to the other systems and just walk everybody here through trends in run size and the most recent estimates of escapement. So here we're looking at Willapa Bay. You can see this black red dot or black line with the red dot represents the escapement. And then the run size you can see was slightly higher than the previous year. But together that black line is underneath the horizontal line, and I didn't describe that. That's the escapement goal. So if I sort of pause for a minute, this horizontal line is at 4,200 fish. That's the escapement goal, and you can see the black line is underneath that in recent years. Now we're looking at the Tulips River. Similar to some of these others, you'll notice that the escapement and the run size are right on top of each other because, again, there was no tribal or state harvest in the Tulips River last year. You can see the run size. It's hard to see the gray line because it's tracking really closely to the escapement, but you can see it was below last year's and below the escapement goal, that horizontal line. The Quinault has sort of some extra pieces to it, and that's because the state fishery in the Quinault River is above the lake, so it's the upper Quinault. So what we've done here is this top set of lines that has this steep decline. This is the total Quinault River run size over time. The line underneath it is the upper Quinault run size. And it's important to separate these because our management objective here for the state is focused around the area where we can fish. So that's the horizontal line, 1,600 fish for the upper Quinault. And that's what we're using as a threshold to try to understand what type of fisheries we're going to build. You could see the dark black line, that's the upper Quinault escapement, and it was slightly below the goal, but an increase from the previous year. Here we're looking at Queets Clearwater, similar situation. The escapement and the run size are close. Harvest was limited last year. You can see the run size, again, that's the gray line, was almost identical to last year. But the escapement was higher given that reduced harvest. Now we're in the Hoh River. This one looks a little bit different because you can see that we had an increase in both the run size and the escapement in the Hoh River relative to last year, and we did meet the escapement goal here. And then the last one I'll show here from the coast is the Quillute River. And you can see, again, an increase in run size from last year, below the year prior, and really within the recent 5-year average for the Quillute. But we did meet escapement here, and that was really good news. The last thing I want to show you for these trends, I want to go into Puget Sound as a reference point and just quickly show you Nisqually and Puyallup because, we're on the same team here in Region 6, and we're thinking about those in our broader conversations about management. So here we're looking at the Nisqually River. There's no harvest here, so escapement and run size are the same line. So you can see we have a run size that was in steep decline relative to the year prior and in the last 4 years, and well below the escapement goal. And then also here we're looking at the Puyallup River that includes the White River, and you can see a similar situation, about the same run size we saw last year, but well below the escapement goal. So finally, we can take all that information and stack these run sizes on top of each other and see in the coastal region broadly how our steelhead performing. And we see that overall our run size was a slight increase from last year, but within this sort of 5-year expectation that we've been seeing. Maybe I'll pause and make sure people understand how this graph is working. Each color represents a different river. And then on the horizontal axis, we're looking at return year, just like we were in the past. And on the y-axis, we're looking at the number of adult steelhead returning to the river before harvest, so the total run size. So then the final piece of this abundance review is looking at our predicted run size last year. So I want to be really clear. These are not your forecasts for the upcoming season. These are last year's predicted run size compared to what we actually saw return to the rivers. So this is a bit of a forecast performance exercise to see how well we did. You can then see next to it, I've added the escapement goal in each of these systems. And then the final escapement, I should call these preliminary escapements, but they're becoming extremely final at this point. I don't expect any changes to these escapements. I've highlighted the gray boxes here that represent rivers that the escapement was below the escapement goal. So this is really the final summary table of what occurred last year. And I've added this bubble that shows we forecasted within about 5% of the actual run size. So pretty high forecast accuracy last year. And in some systems, the run came in a little higher than we expected. And in some, it came in a little bit lower than we expected. One example I'll highlight here in the hump tulips, we predicted 1,300 fish, 1343, and 928 came in. So a little bit lower than what we thought. An alternative to that is in the Quillute River, we predicted 8,516 fish, and we actually saw closer to 9,000, 8,996. So like I mentioned, most of what we talk about is abundance, but it's important just quickly to highlight these other VSP parameters and some of the things that we're tracking in season. So what you're looking at here, one of the best estimates of productivity or metrics is the number of juveniles that are produced. We count the adults and we count the nests that the adults leave behind, but the productivity metric that we're really interested in here is how many juveniles came out of the gravel and headed to sea. So what you're looking at here, Bingham Creek is a tributary of the Chehalis River, specifically the Sats'up that drains into the Chehalis. And this is just a time series of the estimate of smolts that have gone out. And this is the longest time series we have on the coast, but it's also one of the only. Very few places in the coastal region where we're tracking smolt abundance. So that's a major data gap for us. But you can see a general decline in smolt abundance that's consistent with what we're seeing with adults. If we look at distribution, I took a picture here or grabbed this map of the Chehalis Basin because it really highlights this broad distribution of steelhead in a lot of these systems that I know folks on this call are really familiar with. And so we want to maintain that broad distribution and diversity. The SSMP specifically, the Statewide Steelhead Management Plan specifically says to modify the timing of fisheries, gear types, or fishery characteristics to enhance this diversity and spatial structure consistent with watershed goals. So we're thinking about that postseason to see if we hit that target. This is a really busy graph, but I think it's important to show. And if I don't show it, it feels like people usually ask how these data turned out. So what we're looking at here on the horizontal axis here is the return year. So these are spawning ground estimates. So we're counting reds in a number of different parts of the Chehalis River, and we can add them all up for a total spawning escapement. So as you can see, it's declined over time, but it's comprised of all these little colors, each one of these different areas. So we're really interested in maintaining like a really colorful spawning escapement comprised of all of these different tributaries. And we can measure how diverse this spawning distribution is with a variety of different numbers or calculations. The one that I think most folks are familiar with is this Shannon Diversity Index. I won't go into the math, but it describes the diversity of this spawning distribution for each year. And you can see it has ups and downs. In some years, we notice some tributaries don't receive many spawners and the diversity goes down. You can see we've been pretty stable in the last few years managing these fisheries, and we've maintained a pretty high diversity in the Chehalis Basin, and that's a big deal. We can look at the same graph for the Quillute River. Here, each color represents a different tributary of the Quillute River, and it's set up the same way. This is a total escapement is the top of each bar. So you can see, again, this decline over time. But I think what's important about this graph is we can see this, one could say a steady decline in the last 4 or 5 years in the diversity. That's driven in large part by an increased contribution of solduck and kalawa spawners. So what we know is when we have in recent years, like we just did, this increased number of fish on the spawning grounds, it was fueled in large part by a really robust population on the solduck and kalawa relative to the bogashil and dickey. So we see a slight increase or decrease in the diversity there. And then the last one I'm going to show is the Willapa Bay system. So fewer numbers of years to look at here. But I think this is a neat one. In the recent year, we had an increase in abundance, an increase in spawners. But I want to highlight the Palix and the Nema were a bigger contribution than they have been in recent years, as well as the Willapa River. So we see this increase in diversity relative to last year. And then the last piece of this VSP parameter discussion I want to go over is diversity and spatial distribution in terms of, temporal distribution. So in terms of the run timing of these fish coming into these rivers. So I've shown this graph as well before, but I think it does a good job of showing how these hatchery origin early time steelhead enter the river during an earlier time than our typical wild steelhead. That makes for fishery management in some cases, it simplifies it because we can target these hatchery origin fish during the early period of the run. But we know to protect this spawning distribution and this diversity as fish move into the river, there's some risk to that. Specifically, I'm highlighting in red here the period of overlap that occurs between December and March for these early timed hatchery fish and wild origin populations. So each river will have a different graph that isn't necessarily reflected like this, but this is just an example of how we're considering when we design a fishery around hatchery origin fish. We want to make every attempt we can to spread the risk or the impact to these wild populations throughout the run while targeting these hatchery fish. So that's a consideration we're thinking about. One example of this is in the Chehalis system. I think this is the last really complicated graph that I show folks tonight. But I really think this is important. We can see that as we count reds through time from March to June, so we're walking the spawning grounds, counting reds, and these red counts are occurring in lots of different places. This blue, different colors of blue that we see in March and April, these are primarily in the Whatcom and Skookumchuck count. So this is where we're seeing these early timed reds in the upper Chehalis and mid Chehalis. By the time we get into May and June, the majority of reds we're finding are in places like the Sats up in the Wainuchi. And so what we know is that the time that these fish enter the river is also related to the time and the location that they spawn. And this is something we want to protect. So there's risk disproportionately affecting the early or disproportionately affecting the late end of the run based on our fishery regulations. And so that's another consideration. So overall, just a review of kind of the summary of last year. We forecasted wild abundance last year within 5% of the actual run size, and that's good news that our forecast accuracy is high. But our escapement goals were not met in 5 of the 7 years. Future returns are expected to follow these unfavorable environmental conditions that we talked about. There's declining populations of steelhead in all coastal populations, but some room for optimism with some populations we saw this year. In 21-22 fishery regulations seem to support diverse spawning distribution and run timing. That's good news. And tribal catch was less than 50% of preseason plans as a result of regulation changes. So that's there just to highlight this conservation work that the tribes are doing on their part. So these last two agenda items are relatively fast. I think we've gone through the bulk of the information I wanted to share. But we know these forecasts are something we're really interested in. So we'll just jump right into this. This table here describes preliminary forecasts. And I say preliminary, I should probably have put it in bold because like I said, these are hot off the press. There's minor tweaks still being made to how we calculate things like non-harvest mortality in places where we don't have Creole. So there is an expectation that some of these numbers may change, but likely by really small order of magnitude. So what we see is run to the river next to the escapement goal. So these are the number of fish entering the river before fisheries. That's our forecast. I've added this other set of columns here that show the number of wild steelhead relative to the goal. So any cells that are not colored gray, those are populations where we have forecasts expected to come in above the goal. And then the last column there is just the percent above or below the goal. So you can understand how far above or below we are. So the next phase in this process is to take these forecasts and the associated escapement goals and compare them to our management objectives and our fishery tools to try to design fisheries that meet those VSP parameters we talked about. So the way I think folks at home or in their offices can think about that is we describe these kind of three scenarios that each river might find itself in, one of these scenarios. So populations that we've forecasted at or above escapement, the goal there is to meet or exceed the goal. And the options would be diverse in that case. And in some cases include the status quo fisheries. And when we say that, we mean the fisheries that are in your pamphlet. Many of these include bait and fishing from boats, these restrictions that have been put on in the last couple of years. When we have populations that are forecasted below the escapement, the statewide steelhead management plan describes a situation where in no case we can exceed 10%. So in some cases, we have monitoring needed to design fisheries with the precision to design fisheries that will not exceed 10% with a high degree of confidence. And in that case, we may see reduced seasons and or gear restrictions. And then the last scenario, in populations where there's just not enough fish or not enough monitoring, we have these forecasts that are significantly below the goal. Those could result in a fishery closure. So what we'll do next here is we'll take the table that I showed earlier with the forecast. We'll look at these different scenarios and hear proposals from folks to try to understand the fisheries that are important to folks and prioritize where we put the limited monitoring we have and design the fisheries that people want where we can. So the very last slide I have here, I'm pretty sure this is my last slide, describes proposals we've heard to date. This slide should be maybe like multiple paragraphs because we've received a lot of feedback from folks telling us what they want in their fisheries, but I've summed it up into these 5 bullets. So the first 4 ones folks that have been around for a few years in these town halls have seen before. These are really traditional proposals. We have folks asking for a coastwide closure to provide maximum protection for coastal steelhead. Some people were interested in last year's regulation and thought that provided a nice balance between conservation and opportunity. Some people would like us to explore this number 3. If we had fisheries that were closed last year, could we reduce the number of days on the water and try to open those again with the forecast that we have in front of us? And then in some of these systems where folks have regulations that they don't like no fishing from a boat or no bait, there may be opportunities where we could move back to the fisheries that are in the pamphlet but reduced days to receive the conservation need that is necessary. And then the last bullet incorporates a lot of ideas we've heard recently, but also in the past. And so these are folks that are describing fisheries that that last year were not open, specifically targeting hatchery steelhead that returned to the rack in some cases in large numbers, but also salmon-directed fisheries, specifically in the December time period. There's a number of amazing salmon fisheries in December that have been closed as a result of steelhead conservation. So there's people really interested in reopening those. And then, of course, we took a limited number of fish from these hatchery surpluses and moved them into lakes. And we got some really positive feedback on that. And people are asking us if we're going to do that again. So the plan is, if we end up with places where we're expecting surplus hatchery fish, to start looking at lakes and diverse opportunities. But that is a bit of an afterthought once these steelhead regulations are in place. So that concludes kind of this formal presentation. I think we have about an hour here to receive feedback from the public, and we have specific bullets here to kind of frame the type of feedback we're looking for. I would ask that we just focus the discussion around coastal steelhead fishery planning, but I'm really interested in proposals and hopefully something we haven't seen before, but maybe also some feedback on what happened last year. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, James. And just want to remind folks, if you'd like to share a question or comment, you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom, or *9 if you're joining us over the phone. And then you'll need to unmute on your end when we call on you. And to do that, you can either use that function in Zoom or you can press *6 on mobile. So it looks like first up we have Robert Larson. Robert, you've been unmuted.
Thank you. First, I'd like to say thanks for the presentation. It was good. I learned some things. I came up with a number of questions as I listened. One of the things that you didn't talk about, James, was the hatchery returns, and I realized that we can look at some of those online. But as you mentioned, there were some where we had significant returns. And you mentioned how some of those fish were used. You said some went to lakes, but you didn't give any numbers, which I think is important. You said that there was zero fish harvested by the tribes, but I do believe that the tribes got a number of fish from some of the hatcheries, and I think that's important information to share because the sport fishermen did not get any of those fish that I'm aware of. And I forgot to comment, you've received comments from me already, but I do think that it's important that we fish on the hatchery salmon in December in some of these systems, because I think that's a great opportunity and quite a minimal impact on wild fish, wild steelhead. So I would like to see that. And let's see, I wrote down a bunch more questions. Let me look.
Hey, Rob, I can quickly answer that first one about hatcheries if now's a good time.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I'm glad to see I've got Rob Allen and Joe Kudu, who were instrumental in everything hatchery related on the coast last year. And I want to highlight, in terms of forecasts for hatchery runs, hatcheries in no case, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but are a limiting factor in our fisheries next year. So not all of those forecasts are complete, but broodstock needs are not one of our concerns. So that's good news for these hatchery proposals that you've put in front of us. So thanks for that. I want to highlight that the tribe did in fact receive, the Chehalis tribe did receive surplus hatchery steelhead. So that was part of that surplusing. I'm going to ask Rob or Joe to correct me, but I think we brought about 1,200 hatchery steelhead into lakes, into closed systems, to offer opportunity for inland fisheries.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, Joe, do you mind? Is that number right? I don't want to say a number if I'm way off here.
No, that's pretty accurate, James. Yeah, plus or minus probably 1,000.
Oh, so maybe even up to
15.
Yeah, if you have the numbers in front of you, it'd be feel free to jump in with them. That'd be
I
great.
don't, Rob, do you?
No, it's closer to 1,500, but yeah, we planted all over the place, but some of them, yeah. And we also gave quite a bit of fish to not just tribal food banks, but also non-tribal food banks too. Just wanted to make that point.
Thanks. Yeah, and if you got another quick question, Rob, I want to make sure there's time for others, but I'm also really interested in what you got to say. So,
Yeah, I was pleased to see some places that jumped up, and the decline didn't seem to be as much. I didn't hear you discuss the uptick in our summer run steelhead this year, but we did see some increase in summer run steelhead, even though the temperatures of the surface that you showed looked to still be bad. We did see significant increases in the Columbia Basin where we had counts of fish that were going up. And I'm hopeful that that is a indicator of what we might see this year, but I didn't hear you talk about that at all. Maybe you would speak to that just a little bit.
yeah, maybe one more there, Rob, and then we'll make sure everybody gets a chance here.
Okay. So I guess my biggest point is that it seems like there's been a lot of hatchery fish, and I'll use the Skookumchuck as my biggest example. There was a very small number of fish in the upper portion of the Skookumchuck, and we manage by complete basin rather than by systems, but you have data by individual tributaries. And I think the Skookumchuck in the upper, say from the dam down to the power lines, is a very good example of a place where we should be allowing harvest of hatchery fish, and we have not in the last 2 years. And I would really like to see some of those things change, possibly. Well, I feel like we've wasted a lot of fish, and it looks like they've gone some places, but it certainly hasn't been where the majority of the sport fishermen I know would like to see them.
Great. Thanks for your comments, Rob. I really appreciate it. In terms of summer steelhead, that didn't go unnoticed in the coastal region either. Some hatchery origin summer steelhead populations did really well, and I hope folks had a chance to go out and enjoy that opportunity because the fishing wasn't bad at all. So thanks for that comment, Rob.
Thanks for your time, and thanks to you, all of you, for what you do. Look forward to working with you in formulating these this year's season.
Thanks.
It's like next we have Wes Hopler.
Good evening. Couple of quick questions on the content of the prezo. So global ocean heat content, migration data, low river flows, high river temps, the North Pacific gyre oscillation, probably some other ones. I get that the outlook is poor, but you've kind of neutral word emphasized those things, but none of those, as far as I know, are actually in the Steelhead forecast model. Is that true? As opposed to subjective adjustments made post model?
Yeah, so no, we do incorporate climate in our modeling work, but I think to describe our forecasting as subjective adjustments isn't accurate. So we can dig in more deeply, and I really encourage you, Wes. The folks on this call, Jody, Mike, and Jenny, are leading that forecasting effort with our tribal co-managers.
Cool. That's enough.
Yeah, and understand it. Yeah, but
just set that aside. The next thing is slight conflict in the presentation. Statement of tribal catch less than 50% of what was projected based on management actions, versus we closed the fisheries early because of low catch numbers. And frankly, in the rear view mirror for the fisheries that open, it doesn't look particularly warranted. So I just don't quite, you can't give them credit that they, which was it? Was it stellar conservation or bad fishing? So you can't kind of have it both ways in my mind. So that's a question about presentation content. And then finally, I'll note that on the review of the Quillute River, if you look at the graph, You're doing a splendid job of functionally managing it to 2,500 escapement, which is in fact the tribe's position. And you keep telling us there's no opportunity for sports anglers on the Quillete's wild fish because the escapement goal is still at the non-agreed to Gibbons et al. Number of 4,200 when the tribe doesn't agree to it, yet you're all managing to it effectively. So you can't hardly tell us it's something other than 2,500.
Okay,
So-
yeah, thanks for that clarification. And to be honest, I can't say I totally tracked the Quillute River issue, but in terms of the presentation content here, the presentation is really meant for folks to track and get the information they need. And if we've fallen short on that, maybe we could circle up, because I think ideally this thing gets better each time we meet. So thanks for the feedback.
That's what I have on the content.
Appreciate it.
Looks like next we have Reve and Aaron O'Leary. Reve and Aaron, you've been unmuted.
So much. So I just want to kind of reiterate that missed opportunity piece that's been brought up now by the last couple speakers. You know, a lot of people on this call that fish the Hoe and the Quillute were told that you guys were anticipating a 30% or 30% of the preseason run. And that number hasn't been brought up in this presentation. Pats on your back for the preseason forecast being close to accurate, but we were close because of your preseason in-season estimates. What can we look forward to in the future for that not to happen again? Because I know that there's nothing that you're going to do to fix that error from last year.
Yeah, thanks, Reve. So there's nothing I can do certainly to fix, you know, the in-season closure, and that was a tough decision to make. But I do want to mention when we're meeting with our co-managers, and it looks like catch in some cases is half of what was expected. It's really tough to know exactly why that's happening. And I know environmental factors are a huge part. But preseason move, you know, if we flash, you know, go back to where like this time last year, we were talking about extremely small margins of error in every coastal system. And there was serious discussion around a full coastal closure. But we knew if we moved forward with coastal fisheries with an extremely tight margin of error, we got feedback that that's really what folks wanted to do without any high precision monitoring tools. We knew we were moving forward with fisheries with some level of risk involved of not meeting escapement in places we had. So when we're meeting with co-managers in the Olympic Peninsula and there's serious concern for the number of wild steelhead returning, at that time, I'm thinking with the tools we have available, we wouldn't have made a different decision. Even now, seeing that the escapement came in higher than we anticipated. So yeah, I'm happy to see the forecasting tools worked, but I'm really disappointed in season that we don't have better tools, especially when we're operating with a extremely tight margin of error. So I feel a little bit like I need to apologize that there was some missed opportunity there, but I'm also really glad we weren't, you know, inaccurate the other side where we didn't meet escapement by 1,000 fish. So it was a tough decision to make, and I think with the tools we have available and these tight margins of error, we're going to be operating in this situation for years to come. But thanks for your feedback, Reve.
Next, we have Brian Mclaughlin. Brian, you've been unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Hey, James, I just have one question. You shared with us the tribal harvest information, and I really appreciate you doing that because it's an important piece of the story that we need to take into consideration. But I didn't see any similar data for what the non-tribal recreational fishery had as far as encounters, and then of course the you know, applying the 10% impact level. And could you prepare a similar chart as you did with the tribal data by watershed about what the recreational encounters were and impact levels for last year?
Yeah, the short answer is that we unfortunately can't. We don't have high precision estimates of catch for our sport fisheries. So when we are designing these forecasts and run size estimates, we are trying to calculate a non-harvest mortality. I know you're familiar with this, but without, like I say, high precision Creole, where we're flying the river, estimating total effort in a system and the total number of catch, it's really hard, almost impossible to come up with an accurate estimate of non-harvest mortality. So you can imagine requesting those data in a table from the tribes without us having those data for our fisheries is awkward, to say the least. But what we do have, Brian, is we have a report that described a really high quality Creole in the Hoh in 1 or 2 years that we can use to apply to these run sizes and these escapements to make an estimate around non-harvest mortality. So we're doing that now, and we're in those negotiations with tribes. In the absence of sport monitoring, how do you come up with those estimates? So we're using a number of tools, but the best tool we have available is looking at a Cale Bentley report that we've got on our website that you can see on that link, that assumes every fish is touched 1.14 times with a release mortality of 10%. That's our best estimate of release mortality. It's probably an overestimate if we're being really honest. We probably have a smaller number of harvest related or release related mortalities than that. And this is one of the reasons we really need sport monitoring out on the coast, so we can come up with that table you're looking for.
And could I just follow up with that?
Yeah.
Obviously, I've read the Bentley report, and it does raise some serious questions and issues, and I know you're dealing with those, and I very much would support the department investing the resources that are necessary, at least on a couple rivers, to do more that would be required in the Bentley report to recalculate things or something to make sure, because my understanding is you just got 1 year of calculations under it, and it's, you want better data and more data points than just 1 year to make sure you have confidence in your figures. And those figures are so important when you're designing seasons and figuring out what opportunities the sport fishing can have. So I think it's something that's worth investing the resources so that you as managers have the confidence in those figures. And I would just close with this note, the Bentley numbers were done under very different conditions, I believe, as far as, whole seasons. I don't know if bait was allowed or not. I can't remember back then, but that figure probably is high, and you've already got a buffer built in to the steelhead management policy of 10%. NOAA has come out, the best information I can see, with a 5% figure as far as release mortality, and they're applying it to a number of populations that are ESA listed. And we're using a 10% figure, and it's actually designed in the steelhead management policy to have a buffer for uncertainty. And so when we buffer it twice for uncertainty, we may be significantly off in what sport impacts are. So I hopefully you can look at those things.
Yeah, Brian, thanks. And yeah, we'll make sure we have time for others without digging into the 10% release mortality. But I just want to note for you or others that are interested in this topic, there's probably a similar debate on the other end that we're underestimating using the 10% in places where we're handling fresh steelhead, in lower river systems versus those in the Columbia River. So what we really need, it's a big data gap. We need specific estimates of release mortality by watershed. I think that would be the right tool for the job. But I appreciate all your feedback, Brian. I really do. Thanks.
Next, we have Hal Boynton. Hal, you've been unmuted. On your end as well. We might come back to you if we're not hearing you on our end. Okay, we're gonna jump to the next person, but then we'll come back and see if you've gotten unmuted. So next up, we have Kyle Henderson.
Hello.
Hi, Kyle.
How are you doing?
Good.
All right. So first off, so if we're having problems with the steelhead and we're close to going into endangerment, don't we want to prevent these fish from going into those into the endangerment?
Yeah, I think the answer is, if I'm understanding, yeah, we want to protect these populations.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean,
Why aren't we doing more broodstock programs to boost those numbers?
yeah. So what I'm asking is, why don't we do more broodstock programs based off of like what they did in Oregon on the Clackamas River, and help the fish populations actually grow instead of not really doing anything to help these fish. If they're having problems spawning in the gravel, like you guys are saying, then let's help these fish so that way they're around future generations.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So in the discussion tonight, we're talking about sort of preseason planning around these fisheries, but you're bringing up a good point that if we have certain populations that are in a status that need recovery, there's other tools we should be looking at to improve them. So we're talking about fisheries now, but I think it's just a great point that are there, hatchery tools we could be using to recover the populations that need it. So thanks for the feedback, and I'm taking notes here. So.
Okay, well, that's really the only question I have. And then, I just really want to help these fish to come back for future generations so they're around for my kids to fish. And I'm pretty sure you're the same way. And I don't want to see these fish go on the endangered list because we're not doing what we can do to help these fish be sustained.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comments, Kyle. Thanks.
All right.
So next up, we'll go back to Hal. I think we heard you there for a minute, so I've allowed you to unmute again. Okay, Hal, if you're sharing a question or a comment, we're not hearing you. Looks like you're unmuted. Okay, I think we'll move on to the next one. Next, we're going to jump to Tom Terra. Tom, you've been unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is Tom Wallace. I just have one simple question. What would the impact on our wild fish be to have terminal fisheries for hatchery fish within proximity of the hatcheries? At the Tulips hatchery, on the Salmon River, the Bogey, just a basic early season before there's a lot of wild fish coming in, localized around the terminal areas, I don't think we would have many encounters with wild fish. We would release them. We could use selective gear if it was required. I don't see that would have much of an impact on our wild fish returns. And I would like to see it at minimal, at least that opportunity going forward this year.
Yeah, Tom, I appreciate that. And every year we've been in this process where we've been, concerned here about these declining populations. We've been trying to figure out how to open up these hatchery fisheries so we can put these fish back in the creel and not be surplusing them at a hatchery. The issue we're facing this year and in years past is those fishery access points and locations overlap really well with places where wild steelhead are spawning. And in some cases, we have places where we have really great hatchery fishery access, and we have declining wild steelhead population. So while impact in December might be low overall, few individual fish, in some cases, it's the places where we have the fewest. And so it's about designing fisheries where we maximize the removals of those hatchery fish and minimize impact on the wild. So we're looking hard at that. We're receiving some really good proposals to try to craft those fisheries. But no matter what, in places like the Chehalis, where those fisheries exist, this is one of the populations that continues to decline. We need to have a really good understanding with only 200 or 300 fish on the board, how we're going to craft those and limit impact with high confidence to those 200 fish. So that would take some monitoring, some in-season tools to know if we've taken it too far. And so you can think about the way they've managed the Skagit River with sort of weekly updates on run size. So anyway, it's something we're thinking about. I appreciate you, flagging that concern because it's one of ours too, how to get those hatchery fish back in the creel.
I would like to say something about that. You mentioned monitoring. If you had fisheries at these terminal locations, they would be very available for monitoring because the people would all be fishing in a very localized area. And it could be quite easy to document actually how many encounters they had with wild fish. I understand that you're saying that the wild fish that come in early are especially threatened, and so we want to protect them too, and I appreciate that. But we really have to weigh in the value of those fish versus a very rare encounter. And we really have to put that on the pedestal and weigh those two values. And if we just go into eliminating hatchery fish and fisheries so we can protect a run that is probably, let's be honest, not coming back unless we do broodstock programs, you're just eliminating our fisheries.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. And your comment about creel, I agree with. Those are places where we could be really effective monitoring those fisheries. So thanks for your comments.
Thank you.
Next up, we have CJ. CJ, you've been unmuted.
Hi there. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. Hey, thank you guys for all the work you're doing, and especially the town hall program. I really appreciate it, amongst other guides and anglers. So James, I have a million questions, and I know I have a limited amount of time, but I would like to know one of my most incredible, personally striking metrics here I'm challenging you guys with is your creel surveys, especially on catch and release regarding wild streams or steelhead period. How do you guys figure impact versus fish caught versus hours and anglers? Because I don't want to be the first one to say it, but a lot of guys are thinking if you're using low catch data with lots of anglers, there's bound to be certain anglers that might catch a few more fish or certain anglers that might be out there that you interview for not so much time, that also contribute to certain variables that you might use to close down fisheries. So what I'm saying is, if you're using a lot of high volume interviews with low catch rates, how can you correlate that to fisherman skill?
Yeah, thanks. I think I understand the question, but I'm gonna flag, there's a lot of people on our team that are leading Creole teams. But Amy, maybe you can introduce yourself here and take a stab at this one. I can help you if you want.
To it, sorry, my apologies. But not only that, as a guide and a paying WDFW advocate last year, I had a great early season in Forks prior to being shut down, and I was not creel checked even once, personally. And I think that's a huge problem, because I was on very public waterways with obvious point A's, point B's, access, binocular, everything. I was ambushed by WDFW wardens twice. However, I was never creel checked once for the fish I catch and release. So are you guys out there for profit as well? Or are you out there for real information? Because in my experience, in 31 days last year around Mclaughlin County, I was checked 4 times and creel checked once. So that's all I got.
Thanks. So I'm not going to speak to the idea that we're out there for profit. I don't understand that. But I do want to talk about the Creole Method. So Amy, can you share with us just briefly? Well, let me say one more thing, CJ. The time that you talk about fishing without being Creole, that's a problem. Recognize it. We don't have the effort
Sure.
we need out there. So thanks for flagging it. But Amy, anything about the method you just want to help maybe me and CJ get that information?
Hi CJ, yes, I'm a stockist bio in Region 6, and I've handled a couple of the Creoles. Just recently, I'm pretty new to the Creole system on the peninsula. I've been in this position since December. But I know that what we're really, our goal with those Creole surveys is, we know that we do try and direct the staff to get hopefully an unbiased sample of the entire fishery. So while we might have guys who have low catch, we do also want to get people who have, say, different types of fishing, the strategies that they're using, as well as folks that are guides, private boats. And so the goal is that we're going throughout the season, trying to develop a subsample of the entire fishery to make sure that's representative of the whole, because we know we're not going to be able to talk to every single angler. We're not going to be able to encounter every single person and get all of their catch information. So we do try and make sure that what we are collecting is representative of what we're seeing out there. So and then we do answer those questions, or we do ask questions that hopefully, like we ask for, the time that they were fishing, start to finish, how many fish they're catching, what type of gear they're using. And if we can potentially kind of look at some of those variations based off of if you're, say, from the shore, from the boat, or if you're on a weekday or weekend, and what that does for, say, variations in people's catch ratios and that kind of thing. So
Awesome.
If you do want to, dive into it a little bit more and kind of same with some of our protocols and everything, I'm always happy to discuss that.
Like, I have in and out stuff, but I was just more curious in the fact that there is literally no scientific X and Y that you can graph as WDFW regarding fishermen effort and catch. But you guys can X and Y a monofilament gill net, no problem. And we still don't have co-management with every tribe on the coast talking with you guys honestly. And I have not seen as a guide proof of that. I don't know where to access their tribal data as well. So as an angler and a guide and a lover of the Northwest and Washington especially, how can I go find out what the Ho tribe netted and what you guys want to do with that info via flow, volume, weather, etc.? All this data we're talking about doesn't correlate, and none of it adds up into a bigger picture. So I'm really curious how co-management is even a topic here because we don't have it.
Okay, hey, thanks for the feedback, CJ. Let's keep moving. I want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak up here.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you for your answer. It's a typical WDFW answer. Everyone's watching. Thank you.
Thanks, CJ.
Next, we've got Jared Green. Jared, you've been unmuted.
Hey, you got me?
Yep.
Hey, James. I just a couple questions and a comment. Are you familiar with the study out of Idaho, the catch mortality and hatchery encounter, wild encounter from the University of Idaho, USGS, and a few other groups?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I've read it, but there's a good chance there's others more familiar with it than me for sure here.
Yeah, just the basics. You know, they said that the hook mortality release rate is somewhere between 1% and 3%, even on fish, and it's exactly the same on fish caught more than once. Because I know that's a concern for the department. 33% of the tagged wild steelhead are caught versus about 55% of hatchery fish. Which, you know, yes, this is one study, but it was done very, very well with a lot of funding. Probably better funding than we've had for most of our studies because it was multiple universities, agencies working together to tag fish and get these estimates from anglers too. Anglers were very, very instrumental in this. And I was just wondering, you know, a study that comes out like this that says the more hatchery fish that are in the system is more, but it's proven. There's other studies too that have proved that taking hatchery fish out of, let's say, the Satsuppa, Wainuchi, hump tulips, the rivers that I'm really concerned about in Elma, you know, where I live, taking those hatchery fish and cutting some of those hatchery numbers down from, you know, 120,000 smolt plants and down to 70 or 60 or 40 is actually more detrimental to getting wild fish on the gravel because hatchery fish are more encountered in those hatchery zones like the Skookumchuck or the Satsuppa below a certain point. Or below on the Wainuchi below. So my question is, are these things being considered by the department when making new policy decisions in fisheries? Or are we going to rely on a study that we have up on our website from 20 years ago that's inaccurate and false? Because the mortality rate is nowhere near 10, it's likely 1 to 3. And hatchery fish will save wild fish. Because it's like you put 100 ping pong balls and you paint 3 black, your odds are you're going to catch the 97. You're going to grab the 97 white ones and not the one black one. That's my first question. Are we considering those kind of studies going forward? Or are we going to rely on 10-year-old, 20-year-old data and science to make our decisions? Or are we going to rely on highly funded?
Yeah, we're considering it. And I think the agency was a big supporter of that study. And you described it as a really high quality, good study. I totally agree with that. So yeah, no disagreement there. So yep, thanks for that feedback.
My last little thing. As far as the things we've done the last couple of years, like taking people off their boats that they've paid good money for to fish our rivers, that the fish they've paid for to fish, which can you point to more than one peer-reviewed study where it says that fishing from a boat and not taking the fish out of the water, releasing them like you would from the bank, like with a cradle net or handling them without a net? Can you point to multiple studies that shows that boat anglers, now that we have the study out of Idaho, says you can catch fish more than once and they're not going to die at any greater rate, depending on if you're in tidewater? I understand the difference. Can that just go by the wayside? Because there's no study that actually backs up the claims that fishing out of the boat is going to kill more wild steelhead. There just isn't. There's no peer-reviewed, heavily marketed study like the one out of Idaho. Those kind of studies, they're multiple agency and really well funded that will prove that, you know, because I get in my buddy's boat and we catch 7 steelhead, but the next day I only catch 1 from the bank. You know what I mean? It's just not adding up here. Like, you're taking people like veterans that can't move around too well in and out of their boats. They can get in the boat once, they can get out of the boat once. Elderly people that need their boats to fish.
Yeah, Jared, thanks for the feedback. You're mixing up a couple of different ideas there, like that limiting people from their boats is just like not desired and you know, maybe unfair to certain user groups. And then an idea about whether it's valid assumption that taking people out of their boats would lead to fewer encounters on wild fish. So I think I hear both your points. Your idea that there needs to be increased research on the effect of taking people out of their boats on wild encounters. I totally agree with you on that. We have assumptions that there's 50% savings associated with taking people out of their boats based on Creole work from the agency. But likely it's more or likely it's less. So that work needs to be done. It does. So I appreciate your feedback.
Operate on, since it's assumption, it should be thrown out of the equation. That should be less status quo, because that's assumption. We study barb hooks, we study bait, right? You know, we study.
Hey, Jared, I'm appreciating the conversation, but I see at least 15 hands up in the chat.
Like CJ said, this is typical Department of Fish and Wildlife. Deflect, move on. Let's move on from the real discussion, and let's let wild fish and those guys, let's let those guys rule the conversation. Thanks.
So I'm going to just say I sense some frustration from you, Jared. I hope everybody on the call knows everyone that you're looking at here on the screen, you know, works Monday through Friday, is open for conversation. So this isn't your only chance to reach out.
No, and
I hope that this isn't the only chance that folks like you, Jared, that have strong opinions on this, hope this isn't the last time that we chat with you about it. So
yeah, a lot of them aren't calling in because they feel unheard. You know, 99% of the sports fishing population thinks we should be fishing out of the boat, fishing from December to April. It's not, you have a very loud minority from the Wild Fish Conservancy and those groups that have a lot more money and organization in your ear and at the legislature than you do the people that are working 9 to 5 and then fishing on the weekends. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you for your time. I have some emails back and forth with you anyway, so have a good night.
Next up, we have Diego O'Brien. Diego, you've been unmuted.
Hey, James. Interesting going after the last couple, I will say.
Sorry, let's bring Diego back. Apologies.
we lost you there, Diego.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Interesting going after the last couple. I think the majority of steelhead anglers in Washington have obviously some strong opinions and some various beliefs, but I think the important factor is we'd all like the opportunity to keep chasing these fish in some fashion or another. And I'd like to touch on that slide that you showed regarding the hatchery fish interaction with the wild fish interaction. I apologize, I can't remember the name of it. But it showed a really, really strong spike in that December to January timeframe with hatchery fish population and kind of a lower margin with the wild fish interaction. And I'm very similar idea that's been presented before, but I know that there's typically very excellent fishing in kind of that early December through Christmas time frame on a lot of particularly the Grays Harbor rivers for those hatchery fish. And I think it could provide a lot of opportunity for people to get out there, utilize their boats, and kind of get the feeling of steelheading out of the way before any rules were introduced during the high spike in the wild fish population starting to come in that January timeframe. So that's kind of my first comment. My second comment would be in regards to the Creel survey, as far as the types of gear utilized during those Creel surveys. I think everyone on the call would agree that fishing for these fish in some fashion is better than fishing for them not at all. And I think it'd be really cool moving forward if some type of more of that data was implemented, and maybe we start looking at utilizing different types of fishing. I think we can all agree, certain both fly and artificial methods are a little bit less effective, but we're at least out on the water still getting to chase those fish. So I'd really like to see that continue to be improved. And like I said, staying in the river, at least chasing them is better than staying at home for sure. So that's all I have, James. Thanks.
Thanks, Diego.
Next, we have a caller calling in under the Salmon Ninja, and they're of course welcome to share their name if they prefer, but the Salmon Ninja, you've been unmuted.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. Thanks.
Right on. I just had a couple of comments and questions about a couple things you went over earlier, especially in some of the Olympic Peninsula coastal streams with declining runs. Is I just don't understand why we're not implementing broodstock programs everywhere yet. It's obviously been proven to work. It's taken off in Oregon. They're seeing larger numbers of wild fish returning, and I feel like we're not doing anything to fix the problem. We're spending money on doing studies, which, yeah, you can get good research from them, but the sure shot way to fix the problem, regardless of what else is happening in the ocean, is getting more fish in the river. And I don't understand why on another topic would be, why are the recreational guys getting punished every year? And it seems like nets don't discriminate. Recreational guys are using tools of barbless hooks, artificials, things like that. They let commercial guys or the Indians net them, kill everything that comes into a gill net, and then it comes to our season and they close it early on us. And I'm just absolutely fed up with it. I've been an avid steelhead fisherman for about 25 years, and I just don't see, at least on the limits that I catch in the rivers that I fish, it's supporting there being that bad of a run return. I know it's not numbers like we saw 10 years ago, but I think the data they're getting from fishermen are for fishermen that don't know how to fish.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback there. Yeah, I think our portrayal of the conservation efforts of the folks, like our treaty co-managers, is maybe we have a different perspective on that we don't need to get into. But I hear your comments about broodstock programs. We work closely with Oregon. We understand their program really well. And so I appreciate you bringing it up. When we get to the point where we have these populations, I kind of mentioned it earlier, where we're talking not about managing fisheries preseason, but we're talking about recovering certain populations that need it. Hatcheries should be one of our tools that we're looking at for sure. If we're talking about harvest-based programs, I think that's different, but you're talking about a conservation program to recover a population that needs it. So I hear what you're saying and I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. You have a good night.
Next up, we've got John Waters. John, you've been unmuted.
I'll put Dennis back.
Is Dennis listening in?
Maybe.
Hi. I was just curious. I had one question. You talked a lot about the tribal harvest numbers. I was just curious how you guys verify the accuracy of those numbers. Are you just told those numbers, or do you actually go and like verify them in any sort of way?
Yeah, thanks. Our data sharing is really good with our tribal co-managers, but I will let you know that commercial fisheries are required to use fish tickets. And there's a system of reporting fish tickets, not just for steelhead, but for all these commercial fisheries, not just for treaty, non-treaty as well. So verifying numbers, is not extremely challenging. The numbers we get from our coastal tribes, we trust. So yeah, the amount of work we're spending to, dig into the co-manager numbers is probably dwarfed by the amount of time we're trying to spend understanding our own numbers. But yeah, fish tickets, that's the best way to verify catch for sure.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I was just curious how you guys got that information from the tribe. So thank you.
Yeah, the way we got that information is the same way we do every year when we develop forecasts. We accumulate all the catch information in spreadsheets, sit in the room with our tribal partners and get all those numbers in one place. So thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Next up, we have a caller ending in 6604. You have been unmuted. And to unmute on your end, you'll press *6.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, I'm just calling in from, I'm down near Vancouver, Washington. I'm a 24-year-old avid angler. And I wanted to say that there's these guides and different guys in making their giving their opinions and thoughts, and and sometimes it's hard for them to, you know, keep their cool because it's a cultural thing. This fishing, it's a cultural thing what we do, and when we try to get our cultures taken away, hard, and it's hard to remain neutral and look at both sides. But yeah, we want to, and we want to do what's best for the fish. But when time and time again, it's WDFW keeps doing the wrong thing, it's very hard to control our emotions. But so I wanted to say that you need to listen to these guides and different guys and take into account what they say, even if they do let their emotions get parts of it. Because I know it's hard to be patient with them, but you need to take into account what they're saying about broodstock programs and different fisheries that they recommend. Because these guys, they guide all year, and then when they have free time, they go fish on the water. They love fishing more than you even probably love anybody. It's their culture, and when you start taking away a culture, it hurts. It's kind of like there's these different groups, maybe the transgenders or these kind of people. When you take away their culture, that raises a big fuss. So when you take away our culture, we start to raise a fuss too, and that's just the way it is. That's the way humans are. And it's really hard to watch time and time again the different things that happen with the management when it could get fixed and make it better. So I wanted to say, why would these guys, if the guides thought the wild fish were going to decline from what they're recommending, why would they? Why would they recommend that? They want, if they're saying, if they thought broodstock programs wasn't going to help the run, why would they say if that would bring the wild fish down, they're going to get closed down? Why would they say that? They want what's best for our fisheries, and they know what's best. They're on the water every day of the year. I'm just a weekend warrior fisherman that gets out a couple times a month that wants best. I just want to catch fish, and it's so hard when we're getting restriction on boats and all that kind of stuff, because it's just going to keep continuing to trend that way, and eventually there's going to be no fishing. Someday my children won't be able to fish and have that cultural part of their life. That's all I got. I won't keep venting on you guys. Thanks for taking my comment.
Hey, I want to say I really appreciate the respectful dialogue. I don't feel like you're venting, and I want the folks that have spoken up so far to know that I'm listening. I'm looking at a list of 140 attendees and really excited. Everybody's coming in with their opinions, and I haven't heard a bad idea. There's no judgment. You know, I'm not feeling beaten up here. I'm hearing a bunch of ideas and we're documenting those. So I appreciate it. The conversation that would frustrate me is if, you know, we spent the last month trying to get all this information for the public and nobody showed up. So, so I appreciate it. So thanks for all the feedback, and yeah, thanks.
Yep, no problem.
Next, we've got Shad Curse. Shad, you've been unmuted. You may have to unmute on your end as well.
Sorry, that took a few taps. Have you got me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for taking my comments and questions here, and thanks for the presentation. It was very informative. Something I saw in the presentation that I thought maybe lends some room for creativity in the Chehalis Basin in particular, which obviously, look, escapements in the toilet, I know that's not good. And probably there's not a lot of room for anything, but I did notice from the chart you put up that shows the run timing from the various tributaries that it looks like the early timed wild fish are all upper basin fish, meaning the Wacom, Skookum Chuck, that, well, maybe even higher up than that. I don't know all of them. West Fork probably. Maybe not all, but it looked like they were predominantly upper basin fish. And I wonder if maybe just by, there might be an opportunity to only open, say, the lower tributaries like the Wynoochee and the Satssup, leave the main stem Chehalis closed. I don't know a lot of people that fish steelhead on the main stem Chehalis. I hate to think I might be cutting somebody out that way, but well, of course, there's the tribe. They do like to fish the main stem Chehalis, so I kind of forgot about them. But there might be some room for creativity there, I thought, especially with selective gear. I'll do anything. You can make me fish with a toothpick, I'll do it. Like what a lot of other people are saying, I really just want to be out there. Same thing, well, actually not the same thing at all. The Quilutes is a totally different story, but that gets into the, maybe it is time to, that's one escapement goal. We should probably look into adjusting down a little bit. Rex didn't touch it the last couple of years as far as the wild fish go, and no rebounds. So I think that indicates pretty clearly it's not been sport fishing dragging that run down, and maybe we should look at that. Also, along the lines of, and I don't want to beat the dead horse of release mortality too much more, because that's been covered pretty heavily already. And I don't know what the right figure is. I do think it's a lot less than 10%, but yeah, just more evidence of that, I think, is that the rivers that were open last year got absolutely hammered, I'm sure, that being the Quillute system, the Hoe, and yet they beat escapement goals. So I think that's a pretty solid indicator that we're not killing a lot of fish by catching them and releasing them. I do think that that's one tool we're going to need in the chest if we're going to be able to fish at all in the coming years, especially in the Chehalis Basin. We're going to need to be able to get those impacts down to what they really need to be, so that we actually might get a chance. And much less concerned about harvest than just getting out on the water and maybe catch a fish, but just being there is what I'm out there for, instead of sitting on the couch. That's torture. So that's all I got.
Yeah, Shad, I really appreciate all the feedback there. You brought up an important point, I think, of why Quillute and the Hoe are rebounding and southern rivers are not, following these regulation changes. And everybody on this team, we've been sort of thinking about this too. And one thing worth considering is that we've got these 4 H's we talk about: hatcheries, habitat, hydropower, and harvest, and these pressures that steelhead are dealing with. When we remove something like harvest, both tribal and state mortalities, we hope to see these populations rebound, but we know we can't just change one of these dials and expect them to pop. But in places like the Hoe and the Quillute, where these pressures are not as severe, those other 4 or those other 3, we may be seeing a response to really limited fisheries is what we've had. You take away bait and boats, reduce the fishing, close April, close early. So we might be seeing a response from those populations because there's not multiple layers of stressors, or at least the same degree. That's an idea we're considering. The other thing I wanted to flag is your creative ideas on Grays Harbor. I really appreciate it. Makes a ton of sense to me. We're writing these things down. So I want to flag Mike Scharf too, because he's, the designer of those fisheries. And Mike, feel free to jump in. But I think what we're thinking about, Shad, is if there's some even more creative fishery than we've been able to design so far with some monitoring effort, where would those be in the Chehalis? They've got to be a place where we're not disproportionately affecting one part of the run, or either one time of the run, or one particular part of the watershed. We shift an entire Grays Harbor fishery to one area. So anyway, gears are turning on that. Mike, anything to add? Well, Shad, anyway, we got your notes. I appreciate it. There's Mike.
Sorry, I don't have a mouse, so I'm doing it manually. No, those were all very good comments, and we're certainly looking at everything that we can to provide the opportunity that we feel we can get out there.
Thanks, Mike.
Before we jump to our next person, just want to flag that we have about 10 minutes left and we still see, looks like about 14 hands up. So if people could keep their comments brief, that would help us be respectful of everyone's time. And with that, I'll jump to Bob. Bob, you've been unmuted. You may have to unmute on
Hey,
your.
James. Yep. Can you hear me, guys?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hey, yeah, thanks very much for the presentation, that guys, and all your time in doing this. So, hey, obviously you hear a lot of questions, a lot of comments about the Chehalis system, and I think that's one that we really got to look at. Those hatchery production streams in there. I like the comments from the guy previous that, looks like the Mclaughlin, and based on your chart that some of those upper reaches have the earlier time spawning fish. So seems to me we could craft some form of a fishery in the Wynoochee and the Sats up early on, maybe at least till January 15th to capture some of those hatchery fish in there, even if we limited the area that we're fishing. But I think those are super, super important. And I think you've heard that tonight. Man, I really have a hard time trying to come up with anything for the hump tulips. Looking at your forecasted numbers, it's pretty low. I'd like to see some kind of fishery in there, through January 15th, if it were possible. Though I don't know how. When we go north to the Hoe and the Quillute system, and if you look at that, we've been above escapement. Even though we were close on the Hoe for a couple of years, we've been above for a couple of years. Same with the Quillute. We have had some fishing regulation changes. I would definitely like us to look at, you've heard a lot over the last couple of years about how important it is for some people to fish out of a boat. And I know we did a little bit of that last year in the Kalawa and the Bogus Shield, but I think it's time that we look at, how do we do that in the sole duck? And particularly since the sole duck is such a large contributing factor to the spawning fish and appears to be one of the strongest, how do we not at least have a discussion on how we open up some boat fishing opportunity? And I'm not saying open the whole thing, but how do we do some? Maybe we open it from max field down, in the sole duck, and we leave the upper reaches. We're there. We know that the upper reaches in the early timed run is usually the one that's having the most problems. So if we limited boat fishing up there and gave us boat fishing from max field down, I think that would probably help. And I think we could probably do some limited boat fishing in the Hoe too, maybe from the 101 bridge downstream. And maybe you do that through February, and then in March you go to no fishing from a boat for that time. That's when the bulk of the wild fish show up in the Hoe. So you give some fishing opportunity through January and February, and then when the bulk of the wild fish showed up, you could tone it down. And I think that would be, I think those are some options that we really need to look at. But I really appreciate your guys' time. I hope you help, and I hope that we hear some stuff. Thank you very much.
Hey, Bob, it's really good to hear from you. Thanks.
Yep.
Next, we've got Max Heel. Max, you've been unmuted.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, James, for putting this on. I just had one question. From a standpoint of when we actually go out and fish, has there ever been data on any river ever that shows that stopping the sport fish on a catch and release fishery will improve the runs significantly? I'm curious. I would love to read it or figure that out.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I mean, the assumption here is that when we go fishing, and I'm not trying to sound like condescending or anything, but when we go fishing, wild steelhead do die. We know there are impacts associated with our fisheries. So in a time where we're below the escapement or extremely close to it, we need to limit those impacts. So it's not that all the blame is placed on the sport fishery, but we just have management objectives. We have escapement goals, and we have estimates of how many fish die when we go fishing. So I don't know about there's multiple peer-reviewed papers showing when you reduce angling effort, you get more fish on the spawning grounds. But I mean, that's math that we can do here in our shop, right? If we expect 500 fish to die from a sport fishery and we close it, we'll expect 500 fish to move through it. So in terms of long-term recovery, like we look at Grays Harbor, where we're regularly 2,000 fish below the goal, there's more work to be done than just closing a fishery for sure. So I think you're making a good point for places like that. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, I'm not saying we don't do any harm to fish. I was just wondering if there's ever been a total recovery or any kind of real recovery from stopping a catch and release fishery. So thanks.
Next up, we've got Ed Firkin. Ed, you've been unmuted.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Ed.
Hey, thank you guys. Appreciate you guys at the Region 6 staff, James, Kelly, Aaron. We've been going at this for a long time. I really appreciate you guys dealing with all the emotions involved and all the passions that come up with our situation here. And what I wanted to bring up is related to the Quillute system. We've heard it come up several times already this evening. And something that came up in the previous round of town halls was the distinction of the different rivers inside the Quillute system, mainly the Bogachil, the Kalawa, and the Solduck. As we saw last year, those rivers, the returns had been varying in their rates of decline. The Bogachil, namely, being the worst affected, and the Solduck being the strongest, and the Kalawa there being between the two. And I was just curious if there had been any preliminary run estimates from this past year, being that the Bogachil and the Kalawa did have fishing from the boat while the Solduck didn't, and how the returns were affected this past year due to those regulations.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's tough to say exactly how our regulations affected those run timings, but we're running out of time here. But I just want to show you, make sure you saw this one. This shows the stacked graph here, and this last year is the top point we're talking about. And what we can see is the red is Solduck, and it favored really well last year, an increase, as well as the Kalawa and the total number of spawners. So likely the protections from both the tribe and the state had something to do with that. So
yeah, that definitely makes sense, being that what we've said, giving the 10% estimate of catch and release mortality, and seeing all the latest return numbers over the last several years, and how it's definitely not been great numbers by any means in any of the drainages. It's kind of a thing that we all need to accept, that we need to sacrifice something to keep fishing. And it's like, for example, one thing is we keep talking about how the early component of the run is severely depressed, yet the first part of the run in a lot of the rivers, you can fish bait up until February, into the middle of February in some rivers, when a large part of the wild run is coming in. So it's just another thing to think about, that these regulations are still in place, allowing bait use during the time where a majority of the wild run is coming in. And also considering that the runs are so low, it's worth really considering the effect that these regulations, like no fishing from a boat, are having on the impacts on the wild fish. Because as climate change, whether you believe in it or not, continues to happen, like right now, all the rivers on the coast are closed due to the low flows, and there's more and more people fishing. All the impacts on the fish get worse and worse. We need to consider options to let everybody keep fishing, but still reduce our impact on the fish, whether that means less effective methods, to allow people that have different schedules and different availability to when they can go fishing. That kind of would ameliorate the effects, versus having limited days a week, where it's like, compared to having 2 days a week where it's just anything goes, Mad Max, treble hook, bonanza, versus you can have 7 days a week fishing with maybe you're fishing from the bank, maybe some additional restrictions that could be considered to limit the impact of the fish. Because these fish we have out here on the Washington coast are extremely special, compared to the steelhead available anywhere else, or even the salmon, the king salmon on the coast. They're absolutely incredible. They get every bit as big as anything you could catch in Alaska, and these things need to be preserved. But we all also want to get fishing, like somebody mentioned earlier, fishing closures, just all out fishing, sport fishing closure doesn't really resolve anything. And so we need to figure out a way to keep everybody fishing, but also kind of limit everybody from catching too much. Because also somebody else mentioned about the different angler skill levels. And yeah, I know lots of people that go and catch way too many fish. But at that point, it becomes like, how many fish do you need to catch? You should be able to, a fish as majestic as the fish that we get here on the coast. You should be happy with a couple a day, because these things are really, truly special, and there's nowhere else that has fish like this.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it.
Yep, that's all I got to say. Thank you.
I think we've got time for just a couple more tonight. And as we mentioned earlier, we're always accepting comments online at the link in the chat. But next we'll jump to Brian. Brian, you've been unmuted.
Can you hear me?
It's a little choppy.
Well, anyways, if you can hear me, I'll just go real quick on kind of what I'm thinking about. There's one other guy mentioned it, and Mr. Kratzer had mentioned it also. We've got a bunch of different fish that go to these different rivers and come in at different times. So if you're going to do any season setting, at least have some terminal fisheries where maybe you have something open below Stevens Creek on the hump tulips, because those are Chambers Creek fish. And of course, the salmon fish on the Quillute system show up in January, February. And then you have fish on the Skookumchuck, where the predominant fish show up in February and March. And at least have terminal fisheries at those areas. Also probably a terminal fishery below Bingham Creek on the Satsip. And the boat regulation, I'm just waiting for an accident to happen on that one. Some old timer, some disabled guy is going to get in and out of a boat and he's going to end up drowning. But I really don't see that regulation really benefiting much. But in the end, at least have terminal fisheries where these hatchery fish are present. We know what weeks and months they come in at, and have those open accordingly. I went up to the Skookumchuck last year and the year before to go see how many fish were up there, and it was just a travesty to not see us have an opportunity on those hatchery fish. And even though the Skookumchuck program is an integrated program up there, I average about 30 to 50 fish a season up there, and I am lucky if I get 1 or 2 wild fish in that upper stretch. Now, I will catch wild fish down in the very lower Skookumchuck, but hardly ever do I get a wild fish up there by the hatchery. I just hope you take that into consideration, that you have to understand that all these hatchery fish that we would like to harvest and remove out of the system have different run timing, and I'm hoping you guys end up opening it. I'm going to make it short and let somebody else get in. I'll send some comments into you guys, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brian.
Next, we've got David at the Conservation Angler. David, you've been unmuted.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Kelly and James and your team for a detailed presentation and probably a long day. Here we are at 8 o'clock, and there's still people who want to ask their questions. And that, I think, as you said, was a good thing, better than no one showing up at all. A couple quick questions we'd hope to, and you don't have to answer them now, and you can answer them offline if you want. But I noticed when you show the red dots overlapping where you have run size and escapement the same, where there weren't fisheries, it seems like there was an assumption there wasn't any mortality. And I wondered how you accounted for poaching, natural mortality, or predation on making that assessment of the run size and the escapement being the same. So that's one question. I think the other thing that was mentioned by someone else, it would be really nice to see what the breakdown is on the Quillute in terms of numbers. I know that graph is there and shows that pretty clearly. There's some increase in the solduck, and the Kalawa and the bogey is still low, but it'd be nice to know kind of what the numbers are behind that. And you know, time is short. I guess I do want to say congrats on the forecasting effort. Being within 5%, you know, of your estimates is something. I do a lot of work on the Columbia, and that 5% would be pretty. Everybody'd be pretty happy if they were within 10% on that. And so that's great for you and your staff, and shows the effort is thorough. Let's see. I think that one of the questions, you see a lot of frustration with numbers and the scientific evidence. Everybody wants an answer, wants to have a scientific answer to some peer-reviewed question. And you look at all this data, and they answer specific questions, but they never answer all the questions. And usually there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that the key thing we would like the department to keep in mind is, and for everybody on the call, is when you're never going to have all the answers, even with a gold-plated scientific program. And the question is, how do you act with uncertainty? How do you act not knowing all the answers? And I think that all of this stuff is really important. We talked about buffers. Brian Mclaughlin talked about, you know, do we really need, you're doubling your buffers? Well, we have a lot of uncertainty. And so I think those buffers are appropriate. And I think that everybody needs to keep in mind that you don't ever have all the scientific answers. And I think you and your team are showing how you act when you don't have all the answers. And I appreciate that. Our organization appreciates that. You know, I did hear there's many options that were presented. And so there's a lot of willingness among the people on this call tonight to modify their fishing behavior so they can get out and fish. They may not be able to fish the way they've used to fish or have always fished, but there's willingness to get out because people want to be on the river, because we all love these fish. Everybody loves them equally, whether you're flinging bait, whether you're in a boat, whether you're bushwhacking in, whether you're fly fishing. Everybody loves these wild fish in Washington. And so we have to be willing to change our behavior, because this is a different world. And one example of that is going, look at the Kalawa right now. We're all talking about our rivers full of water in December and January. The Kalawa is dry. The North Fork Kalawa is dry. There are dead fish in any pool, dead juveniles in any pool on the Kalawa right now. This is a holistic system. We've got to be concerned about these juveniles that are going to produce the next generation. And while we sit and talk about what fishing we're going to have this year, we just lost possibly a whole age class of steelhead because of this unprecedented low water. We've got to be thinking about how do we manage in a holistic way. I will send some other questions in, James, and you don't have to answer my questions now because I know I took up more time and I know there's other people waiting. Thank you for holding this and hearing people out. I really appreciate it, the effort you and your team are doing. Thank you.
Thanks for the feedback. Appreciate it.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up for tonight. We promised to be done at 8. I know there's still some hands up. Please take note of the link in the chat. We want your feedback. We had a bit of an issue like this the last couple years, and you know, a lot of people want to have their voices heard. We wound up having to limit the amount of time folks had to provide us their ideas. So we might need to go in that direction here in the future. We also heard a bunch of negative feedback in the past when we went way over time. Folks were pretty frustrated that we weren't managing the meeting very well. So I just want to appreciate everybody that attended. I took a whole bunch of notes. One of the notes I took was the number of attendees that participated tonight. I think our peak was at 152 members of the public in this meeting. That's awesome news. I'm hoping that you stick with us throughout this process as we get closer and closer to dialing in this year's season. So with that, again, much appreciation to you all for your time and your effort and your thoughts. Much appreciation to the Region 6 team, and let's all hang in there and keep working this. With that, have a great night, and we'll be in touch soon with a date and time for the second town hall. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.